Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and welcome to the 7th video in our series where we are designing a small rowing and sailing boat out of skin-on-frame construction. Now, if this is your first time with this series, at the very least, go back to episode 5 because that's when we reset this project and switched from building a larger rowing and sailing dinghy to this smaller St. Lawrence River Skiff. So in that episode, I'm going to tell you all about what the St. Lawrence River Skiff is, where it comes from, and why we chose to build this particular boat. And if you want a deeper background on this whole project, make sure you go back to episode 1 because that's where I talk all about my own personal history building larger boats out of skin-on-frame construction. I show you everything that I've built in the past, what went right and what went wrong, and also what we're hoping to accomplish with this entire design project. Finally, if this is your first time on the channel, once again, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on-frame boats for over 20 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets for how to build skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes. All right, so normally right now I would give you guys a quick recap of all the work that we've done on the St. Lawrence River Skiff so far, but that tends to eat up about 5 minutes of the video, basically just showing you things that I've already showed you in the previous videos. So rather than me sit here and recite everything that I've said before, if you want to know how we got to this point, just go ahead and go back and watch the introductions to the previous videos at least, because that'll give you a quick recap of how we got to where we're at on the frame right now. And then you can come back to this video and we can start talking about everything we did over the last week. So anyways, I'm just gonna dive right into this. Basically, how we ended the last episode was I had just steam bent in all the ribs and I was going back through and I was replacing some of those ribs, and that process continued over the next couple days. I decided not to fasten the ribs to the stringers immediately because, especially if you're bending in wood that was green, it's going to shrink a little bit over time. And what I was concerned about is that if I went ahead and nailed this whole boat off and those ribs started to shrink, they would just pull the fasteners up and out of the stringers, and that would create a disaster that would be pretty much fatal for this particular prototype. So decided to go ahead and wait for about 3 or 4 days and see how much the ribs were going to shrink. Also, they changed shape a little bit, which really helped to inform my bending technique. So the next prototype that I build, I'm going to bend a little bit different because I had to go back and reshape a lot of these ribs. Fortunately, that's not really a big deal because to reshape a rib, you just got to pop it out, and then you can slide it sideways into the steam box, let it sit for a couple minutes, take it out, and it's usually pliable enough to make some minor changes. So only took me about an hour to get everything sitting in there the way I liked it. Now, while I was waiting for those ribs to dry, I took advantage of that opportunity to just take care of a bunch of the little construction tasks that I like to get out of the way earlier in a small boat build so they don't stack up towards the end. That way, when we're done skinning this thing, the rigging process is going to go fast and we can get out on the water. So why don't we come in closer on the boat here, and I'll just start by talking about the work that I did in the sequence that I did it. All right, so starting out in the back here, first thing I did is I took an afternoon to make the rudder head for this boat. Keep in mind, if this was just going to be a rowing boat, you wouldn't need any sort of a rudder, but I'm going to be adding a pedal drive to this particular St. Lawrence River Skiff, and it is impossible to control a boat with a pedal drive if you don't have a rudder. Also, this is really useful for the sailing function as well. Originally, St. Lawrence River skiffs were actually sailed without a rudder just by shifting your weight, but it's important to keep in mind that those boats were a lot heavier, so they had a lot more natural resistance to the water and you could sail them more easily that way. I think if you tried to use that same technique in a skin-on-frame boat that sits higher in the water, you'd have a hard time keeping the appropriate control. So anyways, I put this rudder on here. And the cool thing about this particular rudder design is that it's just dead simple. This is something that I developed while I was developing the Hobie pedal drive adapter system for our skin-on-frame canoes. And the idea was I wanted something that people could build quickly and easily that would give you at least sufficient control of the boat. And so you can see here, this is just 2 pieces. We've got a piece on top here that's got some holes drilled in it. Well, I guess if you consider this fair lead, it's 3 pieces. And then we've got the rudder headstock right here. And all this is a solid piece of wood. It's got a slot cut in it that you just cut with your table saw. And then in that slot, we've got a flat aluminum plate that we can pull up and down with the uphaul line. And the cool thing about this particular rudder is because it's just an aluminum plate and the aluminum plate has weight, you don't need to have a separate downhaul line as well like you would with a wooden rudder or any rudder that had a lot of bulk that would be dragging a lot of water. So this is basically just the simplest possible configuration. Could you make this more complicated? Absolutely. Would it work better? Yeah, it probably would work better if this had a foil-shaped section down here and you had a separate downhaul line, but now you're talking about a rudder that's going to take you about 10 times as long to build, and it's going to cost a lot more. And so I always try to go for simpler solutions first. So I built it this way, I tested it out, it gave me sufficient steering for what I needed to do on the water, so I figure why make it more complicated than it needs to be. I will probably experiment with something a little more complicated in the future, but for now, this is our simple rudder system for the pedal drive or any other time you want a rudder for one of our skin-on-frame boats. All right, so coming over to the workbench, next thing I did is I went ahead and made the rub strips that go along the outside of the gunnels. These, along with some staples, are basically what holds the skin against the outside of the gunnels, keeps it from falling off the boat. And for whatever reason, I find these kind of annoying to make. I don't know why, it's not really that hard. You just cut these to size and then you pilot them at a specific interval for some number 6 screws. And then after that, I sand them down and I varnish them a whole bunch of times. That way they're nice and protected. These are usually made out of a bit harder hardwood. Usually I don't do this out of anything softer than ash. But in this particular case, I'm trying to keep this boat nice and light. So I took a chance and went with some of this mahogany here. I think it's going to be fine for the job. Another thing that's similar to that is these rub strips that are going to protect the bottom of this boat. And this is very different than what I do on my canoes. For my canoes, I normally just wrap brass stem bands around the ends and then back a couple feet, just like you would on any normal canoe. But on a boat with a bottom board like this, I like to have full-length armor. And the reason for that is just because when I was first building my Adirondack guide boats, which was my first exposure to boats that are built up off of bottom boards, those originally came with brass armor along the bottom, which I've never used because it would make the boat way too heavy. But I did put HDP strips where the brass was on the original, and I found that it was just brilliant. I mean, this adds a lot of weight. This adds basically 2 pounds to the bottom of the boat, but it makes it basically immune to being dragged over surfaces. I mean, HDPE is not the hardest plastic, but so far it's the best compromise material that I've found for this particular job. So I make these basically the same way that I do with my rub strips. I cut them to a specific size, and then I put these along the bottom of the boat, and I mark out anywhere that I can't have a fastener because it will hit something else inside the boat. That way, when I'm piloting these on my drill press, I know that these marks are my no-go areas, so I don't accidentally put a fastener where they're not supposed to be. All right, so coming back over to the frame here, I showed you this in previous videos, but this is basically just a permanent version of the removable pedal drive adapter box that I developed for our skin-on frame canoes last year. And basically how this works is this allows you to take any Hobie Mirage drive and drop it in like this, and now you can use the boat with your feet as opposed to propelling it with your arms. And for me personally, this has just been a game changer because I have some physical limitations with my health right now, and I can't use a set of oars or a kayak paddle or a canoe paddle. So this has allowed me to get back out on the water. And if you're interested in this whole system, we actually have a really inexpensive plan set and video course on our website that shows how to build this and how to install it in our skin-on frame canoes. But you can also adapt those plans to put in any other small boat that meets certain sizing and shaping requirements. So anyways, that's the pedal drive system. But the reason I wanted to actually show you this right now is another one of the small tasks that I did last week was to build this little apparatus right here, which we call the submarine. And the purpose of the submarine is to keep waves from splashing up into the boat if you have to take the pedal drive out. So for example, in the canoe adapter system, this whole thing is actually removable, which means that if you don't want to be using the pedal drive that day, you can take the whole box out and you can plug the bottom, and then this whole area is nice and open. But in this case, where this is permanent, or even with the temporary system, if you just wanted to change it up on the water, you're going to want to have some type of a plug in there if you don't have the pedal drive in, which is what this is. So this little guy here just drops down there, and it doesn't completely seal the bottom of this, but it's sealed enough that if you're going over big waves or whatever, you're not going to get splashes up inside the boat. So that's what this is. So the next thing I did was double check all the geometry for the seating system and also make some final choices on the positioning. And it's really hard to know if I got this right because there's just so many compromises in this particular boat. Basically, if this was going to be exclusively a rowing boat, I would want these seats to be flat and I'd want them to be lower. But if it was going to be exclusively a pedal boat, I'd want these seats to be a lot higher and angled a lot more steeply. So what I did was basically split the difference between those two choices, and this is the positioning that I ended up with. So whether or not this is right, who knows? We're just going to have to take it out on the water, see how it functions, and if I don't like it, change it on the next prototype. Now, as far as the seat riser itself goes, the installation was a little bit tricky in this particular boat because anytime you're using the pedal drive system, there's a fixed distance from the center of the pedal drive to the seating location, which just happened to land right on top of this laminated frame. So what I had to do to work around that was I cut this piece of oak to the shape of the seat riser, and then I put it in my steam box for about 20 minutes, and then I pulled it out and I bent it into a little bit of a curve here. And then I always mock up the seat to the height that the seat is supposed to be, so the seat is physically in the boat. And then I'll slide the seat risers up to the bottom of the seat and then mark on top of the ribs and on top of the frame here. That way there is no chance that this isn't going to be in the right location. So after I figured out the height of the seat riser, I glued a little oak spacer block onto the inside of this rib in the middle and a little oak reinforcing block onto the outside of this rib at the end right here. And then basically I just went ahead and piloted everything and screwed it into the frame. Now, moving on to the front seat location here, this one was a little bit easier because I didn't have that laminated frame in the way. For this one, I also steam bent this riser into a little bit of a curve, but other than that, all I had to do was block the seat up to the right height, slide this up to the bottom of it, mark it out, and then I glued some of those same little reinforcing blocks to the back side here. That way this wasn't just hanging on to a 5/16 inch thick piece of oak right here. Now, I do want to pause here to mention a couple things. The first one is that I've kind of jumped ahead of myself here. I actually figured out the geometry for this seat and then stopped and nailed off the boat, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, and then I came back and installed these risers. Another thing that's worth mentioning is that even though I did just say that I steam bent this into a curve, I did not do this with fresh green bending oak, because if you were to put fresh green bending oak into a boat like this and then go out and use it, over time this would start to shrink and twist and warp and crack, and ultimately it would probably fail at this joint. And so instead, I grabbed some older oak that's just been sitting around my shop for about 4 years. It was nice and dry. And you could even do this with kiln dried oak because it's just a very slight bend that I had to steam into here. You just don't want to do this with green bending oak. And the reason I'm not worried about attaching it to green bending oak ribs is because these are so thin that after I work with them for a few days and then put them in the steam box, which also helps to dry them out, interestingly enough, and then I let it sit for a week, these have lost enough moisture that I feel like they're not going to create any compatibility issues when I go to glue the reinforcing blocks to the back side. It's also worth pointing out that these little reinforcing blocks on the back side here are glued on with West System G-Flex, because that is the only adhesive that I would trust to be able to reliably glue white oak to white oak, especially if that white oak has a questionable moisture content. So ultimately, what we're going to be putting on top of these riser blocks is canoe style seating like this. And traditionally in a St. Lawrence River skiff, this actually would have been plank seating. But the reason I go with canoe seating is because it's more comfortable, it's lighter weight, And in this case, I actually need to make a much wider seat to be compatible with the pedal drive system. So as opposed to the usual 10-inch wide canoe seat, this is 12 inches wide, and it's also going to have a backrest. And you can't really purchase anything like that, so I have to go ahead and make these. And if you're curious about those seats, by the way, we have full instructions for how to build these in our canoe building course and also in the pedal drive mini course. So this isn't actually the seat for this particular boat. These seats are going to be made on these mahogany frames here, which I'm a little bit nervous about because this mahogany isn't as strong as the ash that I normally use for this, and this is a pretty wide span here. Also, this is going to be getting a tiller bar underneath right here, which is the steering system that we use for that rudder that I showed you earlier. Originally, I was going to have this boat only be steered from the back, but I changed my mind at the last minute, and because this is a true double ender and this particular seat balances closer to the center, I'm hoping that I'll be able to sit here and use this boat in solo mode with a little bit of weight up front and still have this thing balanced for when I want to go out by myself. So over the next week, while we're waiting for the oil on the frame to dry and also putting the skin on, I'm going to be varnishing these and putting the webbing on and just basically finishing everything that needs to be finished on them. All right, so moving on to how this framework is fastened together. After I waited for about 5 days so the ribs would hopefully shrink as much as they were going to after the steam bending process, and I made any little corrections that I needed to the rib shaping, I went ahead and got some screws and some nails. And then the first thing I did was pilot the center of all of these ribs and dip a little bit of varnish in there to protect against rot. And then I screwed the ribs down to the keel with truss head stainless steel screws. And the reason I use screws here instead of nails is because I noticed that over the course of the drying process, even after I reshaped the ribs, there was a tendency for the ribs to want to pull up away from the keel, which is something that's going to happen in any skin-on frame boat that has any kind of dead rise in this area. So I figured probably a better idea to go ahead and screw these down than to nail them down and risk those nails pulling out over time. Now, if you were to lash the ribs to the keel, you wouldn't have this problem, but in this boat, we're using mechanical fasteners, so I decided to go with screws. Now, if you're wondering why I use truss head screws here instead of flathead screws, that's just because the countersink for the flathead screw would remove even more wood from this area, making it a little bit weaker, and also it could potentially act as a funnel which would pull moisture down into this joint. And I just felt like it was better to use a straight pilot and then a little bit of varnish and then drive this down in there, and then hopefully that's not going to encourage rot in this area over time. Also, as long as I'm here, I might as well point out that these little blocks that I put along the keel to locate exactly where these ribs needed to go worked out amazing. I wasn't sure if this was a stupid idea or not because it did take me a little bit of time to set up the keel this way, but it made the ribbing process so much nicer, at least for this particular boat. Now, moving on to the rib to stringer joints, these are actually nailed together, and in this case I used number 14 bronze nails. These nails actually come in a couple different flavors. I like the ones with the bigger rings because they seem to hold a little bit better. And my piloting strategy for these changes just depending on what wood I'm going through and what I'm going into. In this case right here, I went with a 16th inch pilot and then piloted maybe 1/8 of an inch into the red cedar, but no deeper than that. But that might change just depending on what wood these both are made out of. Now, for the nailing process, what I've done in the past is backed up the stringer with a splitting wedge that I use for splitting firewood, just something really heavy that's not going to allow this to move very much. But I couldn't find it this time, so I decided to grab this kind of big block of oak right here and just hold it like this. And this actually worked way better. I was able to just hold it with my thigh like that, pound it in. It worked just as well as the splitting wedge, and I found that it wasn't nearly as fatiguing as trying to hold that piece of steel tight to the back of the joint. Now, as long as we're talking about nailing, something I want to mention that I've said before, but I feel like it's worth repeating, is that nailing is just one of several ways that you can connect a skin boat together. If we look at historic kayaks and canoes and umiaks, some of them were pegged together with wooden pegs, some of them were lashed together, and at least after the 1600s, a surprising amount of them were actually nailed together. Now, the reason that I nailed this particular boat together is because I'm going to be adding a sail to this, and these nailed joints Although they do make the overall frame a little bit weaker, they do make it stiffer. And one of the big challenges that we have when we're trying to add a sail to a skin-on-frame boat is to stiffen the framework enough that we don't have a huge amount of twisting and flexing that's going to steal energy from the sailing system and ultimately potentially damage the boat a little bit. And so if you wanted to, you could just as easily lash this whole thing together. I find lashing to be a little bit easier, a little bit more forgiving. It's easier to get the lines that you want because if you make a mistake, you can just push things around a little bit or retie them. Whereas with nails like this, you have to be a little extra careful to make sure that before you start nailing, this curve is actually touching all these stringers, because even though you can pull things together a little bit with nails, it does terrible things to the lines of the boat, and also those joints are usually going to pop apart again in the future. Now, moving up here to the gunnel, if you're wondering where those pocket mortises that you saw in the last video went, what I decided to do on this particular boat was to actually cap over the pocket mortises by gluing a piece that I cut off of the gunnels while I was cutting up the gunnel lamination. So basically, I glued my gunnel curve a little bit wider than normal. I cut my gunnels, and then I cut 2 separate 1/4-inch pieces off of that. And then once I got all the ribs bent in and I made sure that surface was nice and flush, I came back and I fixed that curved piece to the outside of the gunnels and marked all of these cut locations and then cut them. And then I came back in here and I glued this piece to the inside of the gunnel. And whether or not this is really necessary is debatable. This whole strategy here added an extra 2 pounds to this boat. But once again, one of the reasons I made this decision is because this is going to be a sailing boat and I wanted to make sure that it was nice and stiff and nice and sturdy so it can support the twisting loads and just all the force that comes with any sailing system. So if you did a cleaner job than I actually did bending in these ribs and there wasn't really ugly gaps between the ends of the ribs and the top of the pocket mortise, and you could leave that exposed. I've done that in the past. There's no problem with it whatsoever. I just decided in this case to go ahead and cap this as kind of an experiment to see what effect it would have on the weight and the stiffness and the performance of the boat. All right, so moving on to some finishing touches here. We're looking at the end of the boat in the stern. I'm gonna get this rudder out of the way just so it's not distracting. And what I want to show you here is how I'm going to finish off both ends of the boat. And this is probably going to get some groans from people that are really into the aesthetic of small boats, because if you wanted this to be pretty, what you would do is you would leave this stem piece a little bit long here. You'd curve it up a little bit, that'd be nice and pretty. And then you could fit a really beautiful breast hook into this area right here, which wouldn't be too hard in this particular boat because this has plumb gunnels. You could make a little curve on the inside, maybe make some accents with brass. I don't give a shit about any of that stuff. When I'm using small boats, I care about how they function. And so for me personally, the way we're going to finish this off is I'm going to round this off right here and I'm going to stitch the skin over the end right here. And the reason I like that is because once this whole end is encapsulated with the fabric and the polyurethane, it holds this joint together. That way, if there's ever any kind of damage or if either of these joints cracks apart for some reason because there's a lot of stress sailing or going over waves, none of this is going to be able to move and the boat's going to have really excellent integrity. Also, there's just no reason to have a cute little tip right here. And then instead of a breast hook, you could see what I've done here is I drilled out both sides of the gunnel and I put in this 1-inch cherry dowel. Now, just kind of an interesting side note, I was about to put in a 1-inch walnut dowel when my friend stopped by and told me that you can't put walnut in a boat because it's bad luck. I guess it's because caskets are made out of walnut and it's associated with death. So had to go out to the store and pick up this cherry dowel. Now, I'm not sure it's really the best idea to drill a 1-inch diameter hole in a 1 3/4 inch tall gunnel. So if you're building one of my boats at home, don't do this. This is probably not a great idea. I think that if you want to use this solution, the biggest I would recommend going would be 3/4 inch. And also make sure you're drilling straight holes because you don't want to chew up the ends of your brand new boat. So very last detail here is just a couple of little support blocks that I've glued to the inside of the gunnel and also to the frame here. I've got a pair of these at the bow and I've got another pair of them at the stern. And what this is for is to support the mast partner for the sailing system or potentially the hardware for an outrigger. So you can see here, I've just gone ahead and cut this so it would fit perfectly against the gunnel and also over this piece right here. Scraped off a little bit of varnish so I can get some really good gluing. And then I'm going to use G-Flex on this as well because I want to make sure that this is a rock solid connection because of the loads it's going to be supporting. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it for all the work that we've done on the St. Lawrence River Skiff up until this point. This morning, Liz and I went on a little imaginary boat journey on the floor here just so we could check the seating geometry and all the accessories, including the flotation and the fishing gear, just in case I need to make any last-minute modifications before I go ahead and clean up this frame. Next steps in the process, as soon as we turn off the camera here, I'm going to go ahead and clean up this frame, glue on all those blocks that I just showed you, and then we're going to go straight into doing some more varnish work. Like I said in the last video, normally I don't come anywhere near varnish just because it's expensive and time consuming and not really necessary on a skin-on frame boat, but I've already done enough of it here that I figure I might as well make the gunnels pretty and varnish those. After that, I'm going to go ahead and oil the ribs and the stringers and let that dry for a couple days. And then I can bring the whole thing back in here. We can sew some fabric over it, put some polyurethane on it, and then finish up the outfitting on the boat. So I imagine this video is probably going to come out a couple days late just because I really need to get into that next stage of the work so I have time for the oil to dry. Also, somebody asked me in the last video if we have these shirts for sale. We do have these for sale on our website. Just go to where it says store and then go to apparel and you're going to find all the t-shirts that we have for sale. These are pretty cool and also it's a great way to support what we do here. So anyways, that's it for now. As usual, if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Also, click that notification bell, that way you know when we're releasing these videos. And if you're interested in this skin-on frame boat or any of the other skin-on frame boats that we offer, make sure you check out our website, capefalconkayaks.com, where I have skin-on frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at Cape Falcon Builds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water, and you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care, be safe on the water. I will see you next time.